you all for coming on this lovely spring day to sit inside a classroom. I'm going to try and run through 4 things. As an introduction, well, what is economic growth and why is it important? Second of the 4 things, why has growth collapsed in the Western economies over the past couple of decades? The third is, and I talk about 3 devils that are the reasons why growth has collapsed in the last 20 years. And then I say, okay, beyond killing those 3 devils, what kind of state and government do we need for growth to resume in the Western economies? And I talk about 3 angels. And then finally I said, okay, if that's what we need to do, how are we, the Western economies, by the Western I go all the way from Japan, all the way through Europe over to America, so it's West is a very conceptual rather than geographic term. I say, given that we know what to do, how are we going to do it? And how are we doing in getting back to economic growth? So those are the 4 things. What's growth-wise important? What are the 3 devils that have stopped growth from happening? What are the 3 angels that we need to throw into the mix to really get growth going again? And how are we going to get there? So, A, what is growth and why is it important? Winding all the way back to 1,000 years ago. For hundreds and hundreds of years, in the first part of that millennium, around the world, anywhere, but I take the history of this country as, we know more about what happened here than elsewhere. Anywhere, you were born into a condition that wouldn't change over your lifetime. Whatever your father did, and it would almost certainly be your father because women were sort of kept in the household, you would have the same job as your father. And you'd have that same job for all your life, and your wages would stay the same throughout your life. They would be the same as what your father earned, and they would be the same as what your son earned. And there was no social mobility, there was no hope of improvement. Whatever standard of living your parents had, you would have, and your children would have, for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's no economic growth. And by the way, your expected life time would be 30 years. You would live for 30 years. And then suddenly things started to change. And there's a much maligned historian called David Starkey who he's a constitutional historian, and he talks about why the change occurred in this country, nowhere else around the world, in this country. And he starts off talking about Magna Carta and how we created a constitution that would have a monarch who could say what went on everywhere. Instead of, by the way, the original Magna Carta would have resulted in a bunch of little statelets all over England with warring barons. And somebody came in a few years later and rewrote Magna Carta to say, no, the king's the boss. And then all of that gets gradually changed until, do you remember this Wolf Hall, the TV series and all of that? Thomas Cromwell managed to create constitutional change so that bit by bit the people had more of a say in what was going on, but you still had the divine right of kings, and you still had the king, for example, saying, oh, you can have the monopoly on saddle making. Well done, you'll make a fortune, but by the way, bit of a rake off for me, please. Anybody else tries to make saddles, we'll cut their heads off, all right? And that was the same for the whole monopolies in every kind of activity. Baking. If you tried to bake, if you weren't part of the Bakers Guild, you'd have your oven smashed and you'd be kicked out into the countryside. Monopoly, monopoly, monopoly. All due to the divine right of kings. And bit by bit, the people rebelled, didn't like that, had a civil war, went too far, went back to the kings, kicked out the king again. So by 1688, you get to the glorious revolution and the Bill of Rights, which says, actually, you're just a constitutional king, and we the people, we're going to sort out what goes on in the economy. And that leads to what is called the Enlightenment, which leads to the scientific revolution, which actually happened up in Scotland. No, the Enlightenment happened up in Scotland. Scientific revolution back down in London. Moving on to the Industrial Revolution. And bit by bit, you suddenly have an economy that explodes. And wages double, and they double again, and they double again for the same work. And now, if you have a son, or indeed a daughter, as women come more and more into the economy, they're going to earn double or quadruple what you were earning at their age. And there are more and more jobs, and people flock into the towns. There's far more to it than this, of course. But suddenly, for 200, 250 years, there's this huge upsurge in economic growth in this country. And then also in America and in the Anglosphere. But not so much until the mid-1800s in other countries, who then start to copy the technology. So, for example, we invent the Bessemer steel process. There's a reason why. It all happened here, I'll get to in a minute. And then the Germans steal the process, and they become the best steel makers, Krups and Thyssen and so forth. But the explosion of creativity and entrepreneurship happens here. And that's all springing from the Glorious Revolution in 1688. All this is in the book and probably better explained there than my quick canter around the ground is showing. Now, there are two drivers, in addition to the things I'm going to be talking about in a little minute, as to why that growth happens. And the first is capitalism. And the second is energy, which I'll get to in a minute. Capitalism basically says, it's a very straightforward thing, in order to move forward, you have to have a surplus that you can invest. So, as individuals, if we're spending as much as we've got, we haven't got anything to invest in the future. So whether it's individual entrepreneurs, or small companies, or big companies, or even countries, if there's no surplus, everything is static. And if there's a deficit, there's this Mr. Micawber character in one of Charles Dickens's books, who says, if you're making £1 a week, then if you're spending £1 and a penny, then the result is abject misery. Because where are you going to get that extra penny? If you're spending, in the old currency, 19 and 11 pence, which is 1 penny less than £1, result, unbridled joy. And so that starts with a surplus. So you've got surplus, and then you've got risk takers. Risk takers take their surplus, and they take the surplus of the famous trio, the FFF, families, friends, and fools. They take their surplus and they invest it in an entrepreneurial idea, and about 9 times out of 10 they fail and all the money is lost. So why would any sensible person do it? It's because people just want to take risk, and they want to have a success, and they want to make something of their lives and be able to look back on their lives and say, I succeeded in this. And so you've got all these entrepreneurs, and you've got these supported family, friends, and fools, who are what start any kind of engine of economic growth. And now, that was 200 years ago with Arkwright and his spinning jenny. No, his water frame, he didn't invent the spinning jenny. That was 200 years ago. Now you've got gigantic banks in the city, merchant banks, raising, and venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, raising billions, tens of billions of dollars to invest in really extraordinary inventive ideas, whether it's AI or, you know, Uber. I mean, I would imagine that some of you are too young to remember a time when there wasn't an Uber. So a very short time ago, Uber was this sensational concept. You could call up and a car would come to you and you could get into it. But they invested billions in order to make that work. And so capitalism is the engine that drives innovation and economic growth. That's the first thing. The second is energy. The original energy source, anybody for an economy?
Water.
You're doing well on water.
Okay.
There are a few earlier ones than that.
Wind. Wood.
Wind comes before water.
Caldon.
Well, that's just for heat, really. The original energy source was human beings. That was the only way we got anything done, was by picking stuff up and lugging it, which wasn't tremendously efficient. And the second energy source is animals. You actually use an animal to shove, you know, a backpack on it and kick it and get it to move it for you. And then you move to wind, grinding corn through windmills. And then you move to water with Arkwright's water frame, which was a huge step forward. I mean, before that, in weaving cloth and stuff, you had something called the flying shuttle. Haven't got a clue what that is, but the flying shuttle was necessary for Arkwright's water frame. And Arkwright's water frame was necessary for somebody to invent the spinning jenny. And suddenly this country is producing cloth for the world, because we've actually improved, and all those latter stages are with water, where they're powering these frames. Before that, you had to have a worker standing by the side of this thing making cloth, turning a wheel like that to make the flying shuttle go back and forth and weaving the cloth. So you've moved on to water now. What comes next? Well, steam. Suddenly you've got steam engines pulling. You don't have to have animals anymore pulling stuff along. And then beyond steam, suddenly you've got electricity. And that's the most amazing thing for anybody at the time, with suddenly you've discovered there are these things called electrons. If you can shove them down a pipe, then that will drive things. And electricity leads to this gigantic explosion. Now, in all sorts of areas, now electricity, in order to make it work, turned out you have to have copper wires. And suddenly copper becomes one of the most important things in the world. And it takes a human being 40 years at that time to produce a ton of copper. So electricity is still quite expensive. How long did it take a human to produce a ton of copper now? If it was 40 years, a couple of hundred years ago, or 150 years ago, how long now? I looked it up on the way here, so I 40 days? Anyone want 40 days? 20 days. But still, copper is incredibly important, and everybody's always worried about running out of copper, because without that you don't have electricity. So I have now used up half my half hour on less than the first of these four things. But energy, you move from electricity, which is electrons, you move on into nuclear, which is the nucleus inside the atom. And all of these get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Nuclear is very, very cheap, except for the bloody planning permission, which, Korea doesn't have much planning permission, and so they're building nuclear power stations like they're going out of style for cheap energy. but we have, you know, shot ourselves in the head by getting all worked up. And anyway, so and then we go even worse. We say, I know, here's a really good idea. The whole point about propelling economic growth is for energy to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to do all the things we need it to be. So, I know, let's come up with some really expensive thing and say that's what we need to do. Let's go back all the way to wind. And apart from killing off, apparently the golden eagle is facing extinction in America now from all these windmills. But, you know, you can have your views on that. But apart from that, you're going back to this incredibly expensive way of transmitting energy from wherever, from the wind, in this case, into energy that we can use. Whereas before we were driving the cost way down, now we've suddenly shoved it back up. So that's, you've suddenly seen one of the reasons why cheap energy is so important and why our growth is not happening. Okay, so that's economic growth. So that's what happened. Why is any of that important? Well, there's some really important moral issues as to why growth is important. I will bet every single one of you in this room wants to better themselves. And if you have a family, better your family. If you intend to have a family, better that future family from where you are now. You look at your future and you envisage a future in which you're earning more, have more, achieve more, will have devices that are even more exciting than this. Probably they'll be implanted in your brain. All sorts of things lie for you in the future if there is economic growth. If there is not economic growth, then the average person in this country, in any country in the world, will be no better off, will be like that individual back in the Middle Ages, who earns no more than their parent, who cannot expect a pay raise next year. No pay raises, only what you're earning now. And if you do get a pay raise, if any of you are sitting here thinking, yeah, mate, yeah, but I'm going to get a pay raise, well, that means that somebody else dropped, is earning less next year than they're earning this year. Because in a no-growth economy, it's a zero-sum game. Net, nobody wins. And that becomes really important when we look outside this country, because, or outside what we call the West, or the developed world, or whatever you want to call it, because maybe 80% of the world is full of billions of people, 6.5 billion people, who live lives of abject poverty compared to us, who cannot afford mobile phones, who cannot afford electric light, so that when it falls dark, I'm not saying everybody in the developing world is like this, but so many, when it falls dark, you go to bed, because there's no light, and you wake up at dawn, and that's what happens. That so many things, who don't have loos that flush, who don't have so many things that we take for granted, who don't have cars, who don't have roads, and on and on. And that's the majority of the world. Are they not entitled to economic growth? Should we say, no, we don't want economic growth around the world because, this is all very lovely, isn't it? You know, so why should there be any economic? Well, there's your answer, is that the only justification for us having the level of economic happiness that we have, and believe you me, you really want to have this level of economic happiness, you don't want theirs. The only justification for us having it is if we're pulling the rest of the world with us and promising the same life to the rest of the world. Otherwise, we're just abject hypocrites in calling for no growth. So that's why growth is crucially important. It's in my submission to you a moral issue. And we don't deserve to live like this unless we believe that economic growth for the whole world is great. And just trying to just trying to bring that to life. Remember, I said your expected life, if you lived in the Middle Ages, was 30 years. Can we have a really quick shout out from the youngest person in the room? Anybody want to guess they're the youngest? Anyone? How much younger than 30 are you? Anybody?
I'm 22.
So you've got 8 years to live, mate.
Thank you.
Anybody else? So okay, so we 8 years to live. How many are over 30? Yeah, go on, admit it. Well, you're all dead, all right? So that was the reality of life. When you were 22, you're thinking, if I'm lucky, I'm going to live another 8 years. Now, what's the expectation of life? The average expectation of life for you all in the room is 93. That's economic growth. And for people like myself who are even now getting onto that, the interesting thing is that, this is awful because I don't know what I'm going to do when I run out of time, but it's all very interesting. About 8 billion in the world right now. How many dead human beings lie buried in the ground or any guesses? Since the beginning of humanity, how many human beings have died?
10.
There's fewer than 8, isn't it? There's fewer have died than are now alive.
Since, Homo, whatever he was, erectus or I can't remember, 104 billion have died, right? All of them average expected age 30. What do they all die of?
Old age.
Infection. They all died of infection. I mean, I remember going to a doctor when I was 25 or something, and I had this little nasty little thing, pus-filled cut in my hand. He said, if you hadn't come to me, you would have been dead in 2 days from sepsis. But I can give you an antibiotic. And so it was, a trivial thing for me. Why? Because Alexander Fleming, in this country, and I think it's really important to understand that because there are ways of getting economic growth and there are ways of not getting it. Alexander Fleming, 1919, discovered how to cultivate penicillin. Capitalism, in the form of pharmaceutical companies, took his cultivation process and refined it, and then the whole of the world gradually became able to take antibiotics and no longer died of infection, as 80% of humanity had done before. And so that's how come we go from 30 to 93. We're sorting out cancer and a few other things like that. But still, we die. We haven't figured out how to sort out heart attacks, most cancers, all of those things. That's why we die at 93. What do we die from now? Inflammation. So Alzheimer's, heart disease, cancer, they're all diseases of inflammation. Humanity doesn't have a clue how to sort out inflammation right now, except that there's some guy, there's a thing called the vagus nerve, which is a big thick bundle of nerves that starts here and goes down into the body and spreads out all over the body, all those 8,000 nerves. He's figured out a way to implant something in your neck, tie it to 3 of those 8,000 nerves, stimulate them for 3 minutes every night, and those with really awful inflammatory diseases, people who are sort of all crawled up like that, can't get themselves out, they're all gradually, not all, about 1/3 are getting really good cures out of that, and 1/3 quite good cures, and 1/3 no good cures. And if that work, which is taking place in America, think about it, if that works out, then a lot of you in this room will live to 130. And would you like that? Well, so if you're 22, you don't really care. It's like, all seems the same up there. But believe me, I'd like to live to 130. Probably right. Okay, so I've taken up my 30 minutes talking about just the first of these points. So in the first book, I say, why has growth collapsed in the developed world? So there's the first book. It says that basically, you look at everything that all the great economists, like one here, have analysed, and you look at all the papers, that's all I did, I didn't know. They say, well, there are three things. Too big government, too much taxes, too much regulation. And you can look around countries all around the world, Singapore, Switzerland, whatever, who are growing very satisfactorily. They have small governments, they have low taxes, and they have low regulation. And bit by bit, over the past 20 years, we have massively increased the amount of regulation in this country. We've massively increased the size of government, which follows on regulation. And to pay for it all, we've massively increased the amount of taxes. Now, the whole taxes issue is dealt with by Art Laffer, who says, look, mate, if you tax somebody, they may make a decision that they may turn out the lights. And indeed, we now have in this country more millionaires leaving this country than in any developed country around the world, except for Russia. And they're leaving, obviously, because they get killed if they stay. It's not that bad here. But people are flooding out of this country. And by the way, it's not just millionaires. You know, it's accountants, it's hairdressers, it's whoever is ambitious for their life. They're getting the hell out of here because the taxes are too high. That's known as the Laffer effect, which left-wing people like to decry, but it happens to be true. Regulation is perhaps the worst, and regulation is driven by two things. One is we know best. We in the centre, we the bosses, the politicians, we know better than you what you should do, how you should run your business, and so forth. So right now in the Lords there's a thing called the Employment Rights Bill that is going through, which makes it even worse for an employer to be able to employ somebody profitably. And no employer is going to employ somebody unprofitably unless they're a public sector employer, and that's a different story. So we know best, which is the so-called fatal conceit that Hayek explained magisterially. We know better how you should run your business than you do, is the first reason for governments just year by year adding more and more regulation until the whole apparatus of economic growth squeaks to a halt. The second one is moral panics, saying society is wrong, and unless we do something about it, the whole of society will collapse. I'm happy to keep talking. Or maybe I'm better in the dark. Yeah. So it's ESG, it's DIE, it's net zero, it's on and on and on, imposing regulation on organizations that takes away from their ability to just look at, oh, you know, I make this product and I sell it to these people and that's what I do and I'm hoping to make money out of it, which is what a company does. But once you've got, and we've had a different moral panic every year since about 2012. I go into it quite a lot in the book. And they're all great, and they're all, you know, I believe in being moral and this is the right thing to do, but they're all destroying the economy. So the very people they're supposed to be helping, they are fating to a life of no growth and no opportunity. So those are the three devils: size of government, taxes, regulation. The three angels that I talk about in book 2 here are free markets, free trade, and sound money. So free markets have you know, a few angles to them. One is competition. You're not allowed to have a monopoly. I'm not going to let you have the saddlebag monopoly anymore. You're going to have a competitor who makes better saddlebags and sells them cheaper, and you're going to go out of business unless you smarten up. and I'm sorry to let you know that. But so competition, incredibly important, and you've got to have a society that prevents monopolies emerging and prevents crony capitalism, this state monopoly where you lean on the government to give you an advantage. That's the first thing. But the second absolutely wonderful thing that Hayek came up with is the power of price discovery. You've got this thing called money. In the old days, you used to have to say, well, how many bushels of corn do you want if I am to buy 3 of your bullocks? And then somebody comes up with money, and there's a price for everything, which allows you to trade very freely between all these various things which are the ultimate of what you want. But the only way you find out in money what price is the right price for bushels of corn and bullocks and iPhones and whatever is through price discovery. You allow a free market in demand and supply. If there's more demand than supply, the price goes up, more people come into the market and push the price down. If there's more supply than demand, then price goes down and more people buy. And that's how you get the right price for the right thing. Now, just down the road in Birmingham, there was a law passed. This is another example of regulation and government interference that said there was a law passed, 20 years ago. I mean, it was under the Blair government, I think. Probably the Conservatives made it worse, saying people should get equal pay, right? So you've got all these dustmen here, and for some reason, don't ask me why, 95% of dustmen are men, and 95% of nurses are women, and it appears that that's the supply side of things. Who wants to be a dustman or a nurse or whatever? And dustmen actually can coerce more money out of the local council because they have a union, and you can see that they're busy coercing right now in Birmingham with all the rubbish piling up in the street. So they'll push what they're paid up and up and up. And then along comes another union of women administrative workers, I think, sitting, doing administration, something like that, might have it wrong, and say, well, we think we should be paid the same as them. And a judge says, okay, dustmen, you have to pick up a dustbin, that's 5 points, you have to throw it in the bin, that's 7 points, add up all your points. Now women, you've got to occasionally empty the waste paper bin, you've got to occasionally fill the coffee machine, whatever, add up your points. Hello, these are the same points. These women should be earning the same as dustmen. Now that one decision is, and by the way, you've got to pay back for the last 5 years that you've been paying them not enough, and that's sent Birmingham City Council bankrupt. So you've got rid of price discovery. You said a judge will decide what somebody should be paid, rather than the laws of supply and demand determining who wants to go into what job and what they're prepared to be paid. So that's free markets. Free trade, this is all written before Donald Trump. What he's doing is disastrous. What he's doing has some justification, because the tariffs that are imposed on American goods by the European Union, including us, are way higher than even the tariffs, many of the tariffs that he's proposing to impose on us now, which nobody really understood. Now, he's gone way beyond that and is being absolutely ludicrous. And anyway, as the book says, it doesn't matter what other people are doing to you, the important thing to do is not have tariffs. But, for example, we have, I think, 100% tariffs on oranges in this country? If you want to sell oranges to us, we'll charge 100% tariffs. What? Why would we do that? Has anybody seen any orange groves growing anywhere in the UK? No. The one place that doesn't pay these tariffs is the EU. So we get lots of Spanish oranges because we put up a price barrier against everybody else. Idiocy. And of course, there are Florida oranges, which Trump might be reasonably aggrieved that we're not prepared to have a level playing field between Spanish and Floridan oranges. So nobody really talks about that, but there's a lot of justification for why he's mucking about. But what he's doing is quite ludicrous and will be damaging, is already massively damaging to America in what he's doing. Free trade should be everybody's watchword. And finally, sound money that I'm not even going to talk about because I've run over time. So how are we going to get there to get ourselves an economy that can return us to growth? Interestingly, it's not that hard. In my book, I say we have to get back to what it was like in the early years of the Tony Blair government in the year 2000, when government was about a third of the economy, taxes were about the same, and there wasn't much regulation. So that's only 25 years ago. If we can return to that state, we were growing very healthily in those days. We were the most healthy economy in Europe and growing at 3% a year. And if we grew at 3% a year, a hell of a lot of our troubles would be behind us. That's all we have to do. So having said which, turns out to be very difficult because there's this ratchet effect that once people are used to benefits and all these things, they're very reluctant to give them up. And we've seen an awful lot of people saying, oh, it's my mental health, and I don't want to work. I'm helping a young boy who's just doing A-levels think about what university to go to. He just emailed me today saying, I'm up in Edinburgh on a lecture. I'm thinking of taking a business course there. I'm on a lecture, and it's meant to be about business, and it's all about anxiety and stress and how to deal with it, and how important it is to deal with anxiety and stress. Believe me, honestly, if I've had one thing that I can promise you, what you need, you do actually need in life as you start your careers, is anxiety and stress. You need to be challenged. You need to be pushed hard, and you need to respond positively and constructively to that anxiety and stress, because it'll free your mind up to be incredibly productive and creative, and to teach you things that you can go on to. And yet, in our universities, except this wonderful university, they're teaching you as to how, anxiety and stress, very difficult, watch out for your mental health and all of that. But I'll probably get cancelled for that. So, nearly done. So, unfortunately, we've got a huge amount of headwinds against just returning us to the early Blair years. I think we've got very dark days ahead. The Labour government says that its number one priority is economic growth. They talk about it all the time. They haven't a clue what creates economic growth. With every week, you're getting a new bill into Parliament that is specifically designed to lower economic growth. In every bill, there's a new regulator, whether it's a football regulator or a jobs regulator or whatever. It's somebody to tell you, you're doing it wrong. And by the way, I have the right to reach in and take your money away from you. The football regulator can do that. So it's going to be very difficult to turn it around, particularly because we've got 4 years and 3 months left of this Labour government. And Lord alone knows what disruption they're going to create. You would have thought that they couldn't create more disruption than the previous 14 years of Conservatives created, but they can, and they will, and they are. So I don't know what that says. I think it was very important to get the Conservative government of the time out, because they were so useless. But unfortunately, we're out of the frying pan and into the fire. And even even getting ourselves a government in 4.5 years' time that will start turning things around is not guaranteed at all. It could be another Labour government. It's, in the meantime, if there are dark days ahead, it's important for institutions like this to keep the light glowing and to start thinking about how we can turn this around and to start promulgating the ideas that this university is known for, and which is why I'm really proud to have been asked up to talk this way. And it's really important that everybody who comes through this university picks up these ideas of free enterprise, free markets, free thought, entrepreneurialism, and ultimately economic growth that's going to benefit all of mankind. So,